It is always an honor to come and speak to you all. I've been doing this for a fair few years now, and I always think of this event as one of my true favorites on the calendar every year. It's quality time with really special people in just absolutely amazing locations. Yes, Hawaii was amazing, but I think my personal favorite is Cannon Beach because it allowed me to break away from the group for an afternoon and be a Goonie for the day, which is obviously where the best film that was ever made in 1985, The Goonies, was filmed just up the road in Astoria.
You had to say it.
I had to say it. I had to say it because it was amazing. All right, so this is going to kind of follow similar pattern to previous years in that we're going to have some macro views on things, some micro views on things, and we're going to jump up, and get down. So who am I? Why am I up here? For those of you who don't know, who is NutraIngredients? What do we do? So we're one of the industry's trade publications. So every single day we're writing news about the industry for the industry. And the whole goal of it is to provide the best information that we think we can to help people make informed decisions. That's the be-all and end-all. And so I'm the editor-in-chief of NutraIngredients USA, NutraIngredients Europe. We also have an office in Singapore that covers the APAC region. So we have a truly global perspective on the industry. So in addition to the daily newsletter that hits everybody's inboxes, we also host some kind of category-leading events, face-to-face events. The Sports and Active Nutrition Summit, which is self-explanatory, happens in San Diego in February. Probiota, which is our kind of biggest event, which happens in Europe in February. Probiota Americas, which happens in June, which happened just 3 months ago down the road in Salt Lake City. We also host the NutraIngredients USA Awards every year, which are a pretty big deal. And then this year we had the honor of hosting the Deshay Summit in association with Lauren and UNPA, which I think was a truly great event. So that's, I think, gives us an interesting perspective on the industry, and I'm going to share some of those perspectives with you today. Okay, so since we last met, whatever it was, 15 months ago, there's been a lot going on. So we've had the FDA reorg, right, which is still going on. So the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs has now been engulfed by this much bigger super office, which also includes food additives and innovation, whatever that means. That's still ongoing. A lot of questions about how all that's going to work. We've had the introduction of restrictions in the state of New York around weight loss and bodybuilding supplements for minors. Similar efforts floating around in other states. One recent one in California just failed, but I'm sure it'll be back on the agenda in California next year. Amazon introduced new quality specs for the troublesome 3, weight management, sexual enhancement, bodybuilding. We saw the end of Chevron. The US Supreme Court overturned 40 years of deference to the administrative agencies with Loper Bright. What does it mean? What does it mean for supplements? Mandatory product listing keeps coming back. FDA desperately wants it. NDIs. So we had the first draft guidance of the new dietary ingredient for new dietary ingredients back in 2011. It was a terrible job. Back to the drawing board, 2016. We'll have another effort. Still not happy. Here we are, 2024. We finally got some drafts this year. Well, one's a draft, one's a final guidance. Some people commented that maybe this would mean we'd get some kind of like regular cadence, like every couple of months a new one would come, and the FDA would finally get through all of this. Since that one that was just before the Deshay Summit in June, we've had nothing. NMN, I'm going to get onto that in a little bit, because that's an interesting one with bigger implications. FTC and claims. So in 2022, FTC reissued its health claims guidance, meaning you had to have, or stating that you had to have clinical trials to substantiate your claims. Then in September of last year, there was somebody from FTC at the Chipper event, their regulatory summit, who stated that actually no, there is small print in there, which means you don't have to for some of the structure function claims, which came as a big surprise to pretty much everyone sitting in the room. There was a lot of looking at each other going, really? So we followed up with FTC. They said, sure enough, that's the case. But then earlier this year, I saw some comments from people from FTC which seemed to walk that back a little bit. We had somebody from FTC at Probiota Americas. I asked him what the current commission's thinking on this was, and he spoke for about 3 minutes and didn't give me an answer. So who knows? And then obviously 2024, Deshay turns 30. Big year. So let's start with the Deshay Summit that we hosted just down the road in Salt Lake City. A full morning, And it was truly a wonderful event, I think. A one-of-a-kind, will never happen again. And it was just such an honor to be on the stage and hear from Lauren and Scott and Trish and Peter and Jim and Bob Durkin, and Cara got up there as well from FDA. And I think it was a really useful, valuable morning. And the big thing that came through was that Deshaies not going away, right? It's been 30 years. It's still robust. There's still a lot that we can do to make this much better. But the actual law itself is amazing and a testament to Lauren and the people that wrote it in how robust and strong it is to this day. We asked a couple of questions during the event. One was around mandatory product listing. And there's 2 slides that I've got for you, which are around 2 of the polls that we took in the room. And I put a lot of weight into these polls just because the caliber of the people in the room for the Deshaies Summit was impressive. And I know some of the people in this room were there. So I consider this to be like many of the top thinkers in the industry. So I put a lot of weight into what people were saying. So on the topic of mandatory product listing, I was a little bit surprised that only about 12, 13% were outright flat no. There were about just under 30% said yes, and the vast majority were like maybe, but the devil is in the detail, right? And just recently, Senator Dick Durbin, who is my local senator, or is my senator from one of my 2 senators from Illinois, he's introduced this Dietary Supplement Listing Act. As far as I'm aware, it's still sitting in a Senate committee, hasn't moved anywhere. So probably by the end of this year, it will have died a sad, slow death. But the question that somebody asked me at the Deshaies Summit was, what are the details? So we always keep saying the devil is in the detail. What are the details? What are the conditions in which people would accept a mandatory product listing? Do we know? Because we've got vastly different views in the industry on whether this is a good thing or not. FDA desperately wants it. And their friends in Congress desperately want it. So what are the details? Can we actually get to a point where we can draft something and say something to FDA about these are the conditions that we would accept? Now you tell us what you think. I don't know if that's happening. I'm just putting it out there. Another question we asked at the very end of the Deshaies Summit was, if you could pick one improvement to Deshaies, what would it be? And I was expecting a little bit more of a spread across all of these, and I'll leave this up for a second so that you can all kind of read it. But the one that came out the strongest by far was on the claims issue, right? Supplements should be able to make stronger claims if supported by competent and reliable scientific evidence, however you interpret that. That was by far the strongest. There's so much frustration with what we can and cannot say around these products. And so I've lifted this actually directly from my notes that I had prepared for the Deshaies Summit, so I'm just going to read it out to you. So this was, I was kind of deliberately trying to be provocative a little bit, needling maybe some of the people on stage just to kind of take an opinion on this. But I think there are valid questions in here that we need to think about. So structure function claims and disease claims, for all intents and purposes, are 2 sides to the same coin, right? I mean, okay, there are nuances there, but big picture, they are kind of the same thing. Can something be done, right? There's been an evolution in structure function claims as well. And Bob Durkin came up with this example, which I think is a fantastic example. A structure function claim where you say you're maintaining the length of telomeres in healthy aging. That's a really provocative structure function claim, and it plays into this longevity thing. And the thing that he asked was, is FDA ready to handle that kind of structure function claim? And then that leads us on to this whole situation that we're seeing with these biohackers that are coming through. So Brian Johnson is perhaps one of the most high profile in this case, and I'll show you him in a minute. He takes 54 pills every day, which is a mixture of supplements and off-label medication like metformin, rapamycin, and his whole thing is he doesn't want to age, right? He's the same age as me, and he doesn't look it. So how does Deshaies and the structure function claim kind of framework apply to these people and the claims that they're putting out there? And then you layer on top of that the social media landscape, right? Where consumers are talking about these products in ways that are completely incompatible with structure function claims. And we all hate the whole nature's Ozempic thing, but still it's out there and people are talking about it in this way. The regulatory framework sees everything as you're either sick or you're healthy, but we all know that health is a sliding grayscale, right? So the question that I kind of put out there, and this is just amusing, was that are influencers and the public talking about these products in ways that make structure function claims obsolete? So I don't know, I'm just needling a little bit there. And so here's Brian, right? So we are the same age. I think I'm aging better, to be honest. But for those people that were in Hawaii last year, you remember this picture. This is the infamous nipple picture. He does seem to like to wear shirts that are a bit revealing. Since I showed this one, he has since launched his own supplement brand, because of course he has, right? And what I find interesting about this is two things. Number one is that the formulations that he's got are not that revolutionary, right? They're fairly kind of standard formulations if you're looking at that kind of healthy aging space. And the other thing is, if you see in the bottom picture, so at the very, very bottom of that picture, there's a ticker tape, which is in light blue, that goes across his screen, which says, "Don't die." So I don't know what the lawyers, I don't know what Ren thinks about that kind of claim on a website, but I'm like, woo, he's talking about these things in a way that's really interesting. But it's not just Brian that's talking about this, right? This is David Sinclair, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So David Sinclair is also one of these ones that talks about this use of supplements and off-label medications in order to stave off aging. And David obviously is kind of been in the news a little bit in our space because he is one of the co-founders of Metro International Biotech, which is the NMN company that's kind of tied up the whole NDI situation, which I'll get onto in a second. But I also think it's worth kind of backtracking a little bit and just looking at his previous history, which was he was co-founder of Certrus Pharmaceuticals. So for those of you who don't know, so Certrus Pharmaceuticals spun out of Harvard, where he's based, and it was all based on resveratrol and analogs of resveratrol, right? And the name comes from the fact that they had some data that indicated that resveratrol and some of its analogs could activate the sirtuin genes, which is like the longevity genes, prolong aging, and all, or slow down aging and all this kind of stuff. So he built out this kind of portfolio of drug candidates, put it into a company. GlaxoSmithKline came along and spent $720 million on this company, bought it off him. None of those drug candidates have led to anything meaningful. GlaxoSmithKline has basically shuttered that entire business since then. So nothing of that worked. David made a lot of money out of that. And now he's since turned his attention to NMN, right? So NMN is a nicotinamide mononucleotide. And the story behind that, I'm sure everyone is familiar. There was an NDI notification that went to FDA. FDA gave them a good day letter in AKL. In the March, then in the November, FDA came back and said, oh, actually, there's been a misunderstanding. We don't think this is a dietary ingredient because there's an investigational new drug application for this. So I'm sorry, you can't be in dietary supplements. So Amazon removed it from shelves. And then just last week, MPA launched a lawsuit against the FDA on this. So they tried previously to do a citizen's petition 17 months ago. FDA has still not substantially responded to that. Josh had a great article last week on this. I recommend you read it because it goes into it in really great detail. So NMN is kind of out there, but it's stalled. People are fighting for it. In the meantime, we've got dihydronicotinamide mononucleotide, so NMNH. So this is just the reduced form of NMN. So you can't buy NMN products on Amazon. You can buy NMNH on Amazon. And this is a screenshot that I took last week. There are lots of different products out there on this, right? So in May of this year, I asked the FDA about this. And they kind of gave me a non-answer. They said, we're not able to provide a response to inquiries for NMN or articles that may be related to it, such as NMNH, because of the citizens petition. Obviously, since then, we've had the lawsuit from NPA, which suggests that they'll even hide behind that as well. But in many ways, I kind of read this to them saying, well, NMN and NMNH are approximately the same thing. It's just the reduced form. But if you actually look at the scientific literature, there's enough evidence, I think, to suggest that they are actually different. There's a couple of studies that suggest that NMNH is metabolized different to NMN. And if you talk to people who are in this whole kind of like, is the article the same or is it different? Does it require an NDI? Does it not? They talk to you about ADME, so absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. The metabolism is different, therefore this is a different article, therefore it would require an NDI notification. There has been no NDI notification for NMNH. And then just recently, I think this was just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago at this point, Chromadex announced that it has secured patents on NMNH. And there's an interesting statement, which is like the penultimate paragraph there, where it talks about not to be confused with NMN. NMNH is chemically distinct and a compound that has recently entered the US market as an NAD precursor. NMNH is a new dietary ingredient which has not been properly notified to FDA, rendering its legal status as a dietary supplement questionable at present. Now, FDA has not done anything about NMNH. It's still out there, but we still have, obviously, the NMN lawsuit going on. That'll play into this. And I think what's interesting in this space is because the NMN lawsuit also then kind of ties into that bigger question of the drug preclusion principle, the race to market. There are big implications of that. And this also might pull in the whole Chevron thing. I'm not even quite sure at this point. I don't understand the legalities of it. But I think what you're going to see moving forward is much, much more kind of legal maneuverings around a lot of these anti-aging longevity ingredients. This is a super hot topic. Pharma's massively interested in it, obviously, with the whole NMN stuff. Glaxo was, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on it. This is an area that's going to hot up quite a lot. And there are a whole bunch of different ingredients that are getting attention in this space. Nicotinamide riboside is obviously kind of probably the most high profile. That's the Chromadex, Niagen, True Niagen, one that they've got out there. They had legal wranglings with Elysium for several years. The NMN stuff, urolithin A, which is kind of a metabolite of elagitannins from pomegranates. So it's a Swiss company that's looking at that. Spermidine's another one. Trigonelline is another one. So the ones in blue, I've highlighted those, because these are all ones that Nestle Health Science has financial interest in. And they're doing a lot in this space. Other ones that I think are really interesting, the 2-HOBA one, which is TSI, which I think is a really interesting ingredient. PQQ's been around forever. CoQ10's been around forever. Taurine was just kind of named in a study a couple of years ago that then led to a TikTok boom. So all of this stuff is kind of like, well, all of this interest in these longevity supplements is just going to increase. And so people are starting to look at all of these things and like, well, is it one of these things? Is it multiple of these things? Is it combinations? I don't know. But as a very quick aside, the world's oldest person, Maria, died just a couple of weeks ago, died at 117. Her secret to life was not one of these ingredients. It was to just avoid toxic people. And I think we could all learn a lot from Maria, to be honest. So you've got all these ingredients. You've also got what I think, from my perspective, doing all the probiota things, you've got a really interesting perspective coming from the microbiome space as well. And this is something I keep an eye on. I'm fascinated by this. We have a session on this in the probiota coming up in Copenhagen in February that's specifically around longevity and the centenarian type of thing. So for those of you who don't know, there's this data out there that shows that the microbiome of centenarians actually matches the microbiome of younger people much more than other older people who are not necessarily as healthy and not necessarily going to live as long. And a lot of this data is coming out of Japan and China, as you'd kind of expect. But there does seem to be something there. And it's not just the bacteria that are in the gut. So there's now stuff coming out around the virome is different. So this is the bacteriophages that live in there as well. And you've also got the fungi that are in there with the mycobiome, right? And already people are starting to look at this and thinking, well, is there something special in there, right? Is there a strain or a consortium of strains that is unique to these centenarians that maybe we could look at? And then that feeds back into that list of ingredients that perhaps could be playing into this longevity space. And there's already like startup companies out there. This is one of the companies that we've been kind of keeping an eye on, Anibiome. So they started in Croatia, of all places. Now they're based in San Francisco. And they're very much just focused on microbiome longevity. And similar things are happening in the weight management space, right? So there's this whole, the microbiome of obese people is different than the microbiome of lean people. You've already got some of the big probiotic players in the space already have stuff out there, already have strains out there that are backed up by various different levels of scientific substantiation. Some of it is obviously like, the classic, the bifidobacteria, the lactobacilla. You've also got some of these next-gen strains coming through, which are kind of capturing people's attention because everyone loves a fad, everyone loves a new ingredient. And some of these are things like Dysosmobacter, which is being researched by Patrice Cani over in Leuven in Belgium. There's Hafnia, which is a spin-out from a French university, Rouen, I think, in France. And then the Akkermansia, which is kind of like the poster child of this little space. Much of the research of that was originally done by Patrice Cani in Leuven as well. And I mentioned the Akkermansia one because then that brings us on to this. So this is 3 years ago at this point. So this is all before all this GLP-1 boom. But he had published a paper that looked at Akkermansia stimulating GLP-1 production. And then there was another paper around the same time. So you're already starting to see products in the market that are talking about GLP-1 probiotics using Akkermansia. So this is already happening in the market. And then you've got others that are not necessarily probiotics, but they're playing into this microbiome space. Supergut with the kind of, there's this resistant starch base, so the Solnol out of Canada, they're using that one. And there is data to show that they boost Akkermansia with that particular prebiotic, and therefore there is the GLP-1 stuff. But people are already starting to talk about this in the marketplace, which I find interesting. And then we get onto the wider weight management sector. Hopefully when we get to the end, all this will make sense. What I find interesting about the weight management sector, and I know Jacqueline's going to talk about this in more detail later, but just my very limited view of it, is that this has always been a problematic category, right? There was kind of like this reliance on the thermogenic ingredients, which are not for everybody. The capsaicins kind of things, you can throw in extra caffeine in there, boost your metabolism, make you a bit warm. Then there were like all these kind of like hyper hope type of ingredients, like Hoodia is probably the most famous one. Unilever spent so much money and didn't work. But in recent years, you're actually starting to see ingredients coming through in this space, not just the probiotics and stuff like this, but actual ingredients that have real interesting and intriguing, in my opinion, data behind them. Things like Calocurb, or Calocurb, however you want to pronounce it. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this. This was the winner of our Botanical Product of the Year at our awards this year. There's Pepti Control, which is one of these AI-derived peptide ingredients from Nuritas. There's Reducose, which is getting a lot of attention. Nestle's doing a lot with them. So this is more on the blood sugar management side of things. You've actually got some really intriguing ingredients coming through, but obviously you're playing now in this bigger weight management space that is being challenged by Ozempic, right? So that's shaken up everything. And I stole Brandon's data point for this. So year on year, the weight management category has decreased 14%. But that's not to say that, you know, the industry around this is cratering, because people have pivoted, right? So we're starting to see all this stuff around managing your GLP-1 side effects. So this is just some of the stuff that's already come out. GNC was the first to have these kind of like, not an end cap, but, you know, like a dedicated section to help people cope with the effects of being on these medications. And it's a fairly simple mix, right? It's like the protein stuff to help with the muscle loss. It's micronutrients to help with the nutrient absorption. It's the stuff for the skin. And then there's also stuff for gastrointestinal discomfort and things like that. So this is also more probiotics coming into it. So that's what GNC has done. The GLP-1 nutrition, that's Nestle Health Sciences again. They're doing pretty much similar stuff. They've just kind of repositioned a lot of their existing products to say, hey, look, you can use these if you're on Ozempic. iHerb is doing something very similar. Vitamin Shop went all in on this, and they're actually offering these pharmaceuticals through their website, which is quite a development, I think, for a company like Vitamin Shop. And the Nestle one I flagged as well, because they are not only doing it with the supplements, they've also kind of repositioned some of their frozen food brands. So they have a frozen food brand called Vital Pursuit, which is kind of high protein. They've repositioned this in this space. And the biggest losers in all of this Ozempic stuff is going to be the food industry, right? So people who are on Ozempic typically buy, I think the stat is something like between 8 and 10% fewer groceries than people who are not on this. And when you actually look at the number of people in the market that are on these medications, and then you extrapolate that to the whole market, I read a statistic the other day that said that grocery sales in the US have declined 3% over the last year. So a lot of, you know, and the margins in food are small to begin with, so you're going to have a lot of these big food companies starting to hurt, pushing back on this, and you're going to see, I think, a lot of them starting to play into this space as well, which makes them kind of competitors to the stuff that's happening in the supplement space. But then also in the weight management space, you've got things like this happening, right? So you've got the states acting against it. We had the one in New York. California didn't work. But it's a really interesting ecosystem of super amount of interest, companies pivoting to figure it out, but then also states stepping into it and making it difficult for people to play within certain spaces. And it's all just getting, from an observer perspective, fascinating to watch how people will respond to this. And I'm going to pivot slightly now, because what happens at the states is obviously having a big influence on what's happening kind of like globally for the industry, right? So we had this stuff on the weight management. Some of these bills include bodybuilding supplements, for kind of teens and minors. Some of them don't. But these are having kind of outsized effects on the industry. Another one that we had, California again leading the way, they went after a bunch of food additives, right? Which included initially titanium dioxide. Lots of industry groups came together, particularly on the food side, and the confectionery people in particular came through and lobbied hard. This eventually was signed into law. Titanium dioxide was removed. But other states are now looking at these kind of lists as well. A lot of these things are kind of being assessed in other states. What's interesting about this, in my opinion, and the kind of way you need to start joining the dots globally, is the inspiration for this, which came from the Environmental Working Group and Consumer Reports, was this, right? So in Europe, EFSA banned titanium dioxide, said it wasn't safe. That was picked up, and that was used as kind of justification as to why it should be banned, and they went to California. Let's start with, the biggest economy in the US. Let's go after that. So you have to keep an eye very closely on what's happening to Europe, which leads me on to this, right? There are huge concerns in various different member states in Europe around ashwagandha. Now, whether that's well-meaning or completely misplaced, I'll let others comment on that, but this is happening. And my colleague, Nikki Hancock, who's the editor of Nutrient Europe, she's been doing a fantastic job keeping up to date on this. So Denmark has now banned it, ashwagandha. The UK has added it to a list and is doing like a consultation, a consultation on it. France is now looking at it. People in the industry have started pushing back on it a little bit. I think this is my favorite headline that we've run all year, the ashwagandha concerns branded pure horse shit, which when you know what ashwagandha means in Sanskrit, it's a funny little play. But it's not just ashwagandha, right? Melatonin is also coming under the microscope. So Norway, a couple of years ago, its public health agency released a report which basically said there's no evidence that we can see for safety in children. We can't conclude any safety on continuous use of just 1 milligram a day for 3 months. Germany, I don't know how your German is Thomas in the room? They just released this report where they are expressing concerns with melatonin. And it's not just these two ingredients. So just recently, I don't know if anyone saw this, but the head of the food safety agencies in Europe released a report looking at food supplements. They assessed something like 117 substances. 13 were listed as cause for concern. And they include curcumin, melatonin, piperine, ashwagandha. Is that black cohosh on there as well? I mean, there's lots of different ones on here, right? And so we ran a guest article yesterday on Nutrient Europe, which was from EHPM, Livia Manichietti, who's the executive director of EHPM, which is the European Federation of Associations of Food Manufacturers, Food Health Product Manufacturers. I think that's it. EHPM. So anyway, look it up on Nutrient Europe, where she kind of very systematically goes through it, explains what the HOA is. It doesn't carry any kind of like legal force, but it does feed into what happens at a European level. Like the European Commission can look at it, member states can then ask people based on the report to start looking at it, and it could then lead to what they call Article 8. So Article 8 is a mechanism within the European Union to restrict access to these things, which even if it's like one or two of these things, I mean, that has potential and knock-on effects. Undoubtedly, interest groups in the US will look at this thing and start to raise concerns. So I would say keep an eye on that. And I don't want to be too much of a Debbie Downer in this, because this is all very wah, 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 this is all bad news things. Can we get onto something a bit more positive? So I will try to now. We'll try and position it and look forward. So that's stuff that's happening, that's stuff that could be on the horizon. But then if we look forward to 30 years of Deshay, let's kind of see what the industry looks like moving forward. And this was the question that we had at the very start that we asked at the Deshay Summit. These are just the questions that we put up on stage. I added number 7. It wasn't on the original list, which was the mandatory product listing, just because I think it's an interesting one to add in there. So if you say, well, why do we have to just pick one? Maybe we could pick more than one. And I think some of these actually have legs, right? So triple the budget for ODSP and enforce Deshay to the max. That's not happening, right? So we can probably forget about that. Decouple FDA from DOJ and give it litigation authority. I mean, The legislative fix to that would be, I just don't even know where to start with that, so I'm going to grey that one out too. Decouple food from FDA and join it with USDA. This is an idea that's been floating around for years. Not going to happen. So let's get rid of that one. Rework the drug preclusion clause to make it equitable. That one, I think, depending on what happens with the NMN lawsuit, there may be something there, right? Claims, make stronger claims. Like I said at the start, I almost feel like it's happening already, whether the FDA likes it or not. Obviously, everyone in this room has to play within the framework of structure function claims, but the wider conversation is going on in all different kind of directions. Revisit the definition of dietary supplements to specifically include things like microorganisms, technology like plant cell cultivation. Cara Welch at FDA has said to me on a couple of different occasions, and we even talked about this on stage at the Deshay Summit, she spends a lot of time thinking about the definition of dietary supplements. She's also said that she thinks the definition is inhibitive to innovation in the dietary supplement space, because there's things like these plant cell cultivation things, where do they sit, right? Do they sit within the definition? Is it, because the specific language is herb, is that an herb? You could probably argue it's a botanical ingredient, but is it an herb? I would say probably not. So where does that kind of thing sit? Microorganisms, probiotics, they're not mentioned at any point, right? They're kind of in that catch-all section at the end of constituents of the diet. But there's no specific stuff in there. And then when you start to get into some of this disruptive technology like CRISPR, like people are playing around with gene editing of probiotics, where does that kind of thing sit? No idea. But I think there might be some appetite from both sides to maybe look at that, but I don't know how you do it. Introduce a mandatory product listing if both sides can agree on the details. I almost wonder if you agree to that, can you agree to the definition? I don't know. That's not my job. I'll leave it to somebody else. And then this last one I think is really interesting to consider, right? Form a dietary supplement self-regulatory body, and I think this was your suggestion, Lauren, to add to the list. I almost feel like that's kind of organically happening to a certain extent. There's no formal body there, but when you look at what's happening on this, in this, we are starting to self-police much more. And huge credit to Jim and Katie and the Now Foods team, who were so incredibly brave to put their heads above the battlements to begin with and say, you know what, things are not right here. And we're going to call it out almost, regardless of the potential legal threat that may be under, we're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. And they've kept doing it. And I think it's opened a lot of eyes, because now you're starting to see other companies getting into it, slowly dipping their feet in the water. I mean, it's not like a consortium of testing or anything, but I think now deserves a huge amount of credit for doing this and for keeping to do this as well. Just recently we had Balchem and Alchemist work together on vitamin K2. You've got some of the people in the longevity space, Timeline, which is Amazentis, they tested the urolithin A supplements that were out there. Chromadex, obviously, because they were looking to, in many ways, protect the nicotinamide riboside, the NR, the Niagen, that was selling well on Amazon. They started testing the NMN stuff before Amazon removed it. So these are obviously like companies testing. What I think is interesting is now you've got, like the one on the left here, this was done by independent researchers from universities in the Netherlands and Singapore. And they're interested in longevity and this kind of emerging geroscience side of things. They're independently going out and testing these things. And they're publishing it in very high-profile journals. And I think that you're starting to see some kind of like momentum build around this. And I think there is a lot to be said about the whole kind of like name and shame. Like, who are the supplements out there that are not doing things properly? That feels like perhaps the beginnings of self-regulatory. Then you've got the retailer part of this conversation. Lots of different retailers are obviously coming to the table with their own quality specs. Wegmans, which I think works with NSF. CVS, which I think works with UL. If you want to get into Whole Foods, you've got to go through their whole set of testing. There's ingredients that you can use, can't use. And then obviously GRMA has done a lot to kind of like benchmark a lot of the GMP stuff going on. This feels like there's something there. And then obviously we can't ignore the 300-pound gorilla in the room, which is Amazon. They introduced this earlier this year, focusing, I think quite rightly, on the weight management, sexual enhancement, sports nutrition sectors. These are always been problematic categories for the industry. FDA has always mentioned them as like the three troublesome ones. Amazon has needed to do something and has done something, right? And I know there's been a lot of debate in the industry about how it was rolled out and transparency around it and all the rest of it. They needed to do something and they've done something. So now the question is then, what comes next? There was kind of a little bit of confusion earlier in the year around joint health. Was joint health going to be added? And actually in my early conversations, when the first 3 were announced, joint health was one of these ones that was told to me by somebody who had been supposedly speaking directly to Amazon. So it's obviously been there. It didn't make sense to me because I was like, well, you're going to have to weight management, sexual enhancement, bodybuilding, where does joint health come into it? But it keeps kind of cropping up as in part of the conversation. So that makes me think that it's coming. I think you could do quite an easy fix on probiotics if you just insist on CFUs and strain level designations. I think you could make a dent on that category as well. So there's things that are happening, right? And I think that when you think back that it's 30 years of DSHEA, things seem to be moving in the right direction. They're not going to jump forward. We're not going to get a complete rewrite of what is out there. I also think kind of talking about other regulatory frameworks is a little bit of a non-starter in many ways, because you know the grass is always greener. But if you look around, what are the other examples that are out there, right? The European Union, I think with the whole health claims, I think maybe the initial sentiment behind that was good. The way it's been executed has been god-awful, right? Canada, they had a pretty good system, and then they've just ruined it, really, recently. I don't know if you've spoken to people up in Canada and how this is going. It's a mess up there, right? The TGA in Australia is kind of like held up as one, but you still got to think these things are regulated as medicines there. So that's a very different conversation. So I think, trying to be positive about things, DSHEA at 30, like I said at the start, it's not going anywhere. There's an amazing framework there for everyone to build on and continue to develop. And it is a lasting testament to the brilliance of the architects who wrote it. We also now live in this rapidly changing world where you've got all of these disruptive technologies I'm sure Tim will talk about later. You've got the influence of AI. You've got gene editing techniques like the CRISPR stuff that I mentioned, omics. You've got the precision fermentation things coming through, plant cell cultures. And SoMe, that's my shorthand for social media, because social media is all about me. It's so me. And how people are talking about it there. And then on the other side, you've got these macro issues like climate change, geopolitics impacting supply chain. So can the industry keep up with this? I would say certain aspects of it, definitely. And I think there's an entrepreneurial side of the industry that can definitely keep up with it. Can FDA keep up with it? I have no idea. So I do think that moving forward, there's a huge amount of opportunity there. But taking one step back, I think what we did with the DSHEA Summit was really, really important because it provided everybody with a view of what the world was like before DSHEA, what we all went through. I'm talking about the royal we. What we all went through to get DSHEA, to pass DSHEA. There was a lot of things that happened. There was a lot of knowledge that was shared in that room that was so valuable for people to hear because they hadn't heard it before, right? There's a lot of young people coming into this industry attracted by everything that they're seeing on social media and all the rest of it. Let's not forget the lessons of the past. And I think we at NutraIngredients have done a pretty good job of covering a lot of these things. So my colleague Asia Sherman, who's hiding at the back, she did a really great article on the Proxmire amendments, right, which happened in the 70s. You wouldn't believe how difficult it was to get a copy of those Proxmire amendments. Like, those things were difficult to track down. Asia finally got her hands on it, which was great, and she wrote a really important article. It was Proxmire that, part of that language was then fed into DSHEA, right? There's other things that we've kind of lost along the way. So there was the MPQAA. So this was a Jeff Bland initiative, I think. Oh, Sandy Gooch. Oh, I'm sorry, MPQAA. So yeah, and for many people in the room, you'll notice the initials, the MPQAA, which was then kind of taken on in a different form for single malts. But this played a huge role, right, in convincing Congress of the scientific basis of these products, right? It was really important, and I think we've lost a little bit of that knowledge. So are there things there that we can look back on and learn from as we move forward? And then obviously, for Marley versus Heckler, I've written probably like 4,000 articles since I've been with NutraIngredients. I've been there almost 20 years at this point. This is one of the articles that I'm most proud of writing about because it was such a kind of slightly obscure thing, but it had such massive implications at the time. And I have to give Mark a huge amount of credit because Mark put me in contact with Ben Zarikor. So Ben Zarikor was the guy behind the formality. He was the guy that took on the FDA at a time when you didn't take on the FDA. And this had extra significance because it was not only kind of shone a light on this very important court case back in the day, but I spent probably like an hour and a half on the phone with Ben and his wife, Louise, talking about this. And a couple of months later after this, Ben passed away. So we were able to just luckily capture what he had to say about this. And so that's why this is one of my probably proudest articles I've ever written. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight on these things and that there is a depository somewhere of all of this information so that we can build on it. We have to build on it. And then I just want to finish very, very quickly in like the last 2 seconds to say, if we're looking back, let's not forget this one. So almost 10 years ago now, we were living through this. 9 years ago, we were living through this. So this was the New York Attorney General. Investigation into herbal dietary supplements. All of it was sparked by a 2013 paper from the University of Guelph, which looked at used DNA barcoding technology to look at herbal products in the marketplace. Huge credit to Mark and ABC because as soon as this thing was published, they were on it and they were like, it needs to be retracted. There are serious flaws with this. The journal pushed back massively over the years because it was a huge traffic driver for them. The University of Guelph kind of circled the wagons around its researcher. It then ultimately led to a New York Times article, which then led to the New York Attorney General's investigation. Mike Archbold, who was GNC at the CEO of GNC at the time, I think probably lived through hell kind of dealing with this because they were kind of target number one in all of this. Other companies were implicated as well, but GNC took the brunt of it. And then finally, just this year, this paper was finally retracted. And I think that this is important. There are lessons that this industry can learn from this as well, right? And we have to remember. And I think it shows the huge value of organizations like ABC that were on this from day one and kept fighting until it was finally retracted. And I don't think anyone took any great pleasure in seeing this retracted, but it was important that it was. So, lots to think about, lots happening. Let's not forget the lessons of the past, but let's also move forward. That's it. And I'm on time.